Thank you, Stanley. I want to let you know that I may have lied earlier in this meeting, about our three guests. And they're looking at me like, oh God, what is that guy going to say? We very likely will have a fourth guest, but a surprise. So as Arun talks to you, you might want to think, I wonder who he's talking about. And then if that person doesn't show up, I'll just say I was bluffing. So, Arun?
So I'm going to start with my conclusion first in terms of what can progressives do about the current state of affairs. I think that's the most important question. We can sit here and complain, we can analyze, but it's what can we do about it? And I think what needs to be done is very simple. Doing it, is the art of politics, and I leave that to the politicians. But what really needs to be done from a progressive perspective, in terms of what Stanley's talking about, how do we get those social movements back? The state plays a vital role in helping to create the conditions of social movements. 1930s has a lot of unique historical factors that are not going to be replicated in terms of what was happening in world history with the socialist movements in countries throughout the world. But if we look at the social movements that have come up over the last 50, 60 years, they tend to happen during Democratic presidencies. Why? Because when you have movements during Republican presidencies, they tend to be partisan. In other words, they only oppose who is in office, and they're like, let's get the Democrats in and everything will be fine. But then the Democrats come in and we find that everything isn't fine. So what really needs to happen is you need to unapologetically support redistributive policies, right? That is the role that progressives can play. We don't need a second party of the free market. That's what the Democratic establishment really is doing now. It's basically the way it operates, and the way that all kind of left-leaning parties, though they're not left-leaning parties, operate in the developed world, is what they basically say, we're going to manage modern capitalism better. In other words, we're going to do it more efficiently, we're going to return more profit that we'll be able to tax, and we can redistribute a little bit of that down in terms of social welfare. That's basically kind of state-led trickle-down economics, but that's really what it is when we think about it. So what progressives can do is to really unapologetically support redistributive policies. One, because it's the right thing to do, but when you have redistribution, you create the social space. It's not an accident that the 1960s was the high point in the last 50 years. That's when the U.S. had the greatest level of income equality. That's when people had the freedom to be able to think beyond the market system and to agitate for all sorts of positive social change in terms of the Black freedom struggle, in terms of the second wave feminism, in terms of the student movement, the New Left, the anti-Vietnam War movements, and all the other movements that came out of the 1960s, that people had the space. I'm sure people are familiar with Michael Moore, and you probably have all seen Sicko, right? There's a scene in there when he's interviewing workers in France, and they say this directly, us having healthcare, us having what's called the social wage, allows us to go out on the streets and protest, okay? Because we have these things that we know are backing us up. We can think beyond the daily struggle. Now, Stanley's work is, he's in the academy. He's really one of the foremost, I think, leading political commentators in the country today. My work is more at the grassroots. In the last 3 years, I've traveled around the country 7 times, reporting on all sorts of movements. I've interviewed over 1,000 people across the spectrum, farmers, workers, business owners. I've covered everything from Occupy Wall Street to the Tea Party movement. I'm interested in really what's the fundamental shape of social movements in this country. So that's what I want to talk about. in relation to poverty, to what's going on. Now, one thing that has changed in recent years, when I was younger, I've always followed the stock market. I joke that's my sports. I find the stock market far more interesting than sports game. There's a lot more drama to it. But it always confused me, like, why can't you talk about capitalism? If that was something that was forbidden. It's only in the last few years that we can finally say capitalism, right? You know, it's just like, there's something Old Testament about it. Like if you're gonna say Jehovah, everyone's gonna stone you as some sort of heretic. So we can finally say capitalism, because if you're gonna talk about poverty, you have to talk about capitalism. Now, one of the people I met, a couple that really I think was very affecting was, and often I have to use pseudonyms because people did not want their real names to be used, and this was a Walmart worker, which you can understand why they wouldn't want their real names used. So Janet and Brad, they're in their 50s and 60s. They live in Missouri, in the Ozarks, where Walmart began. Janet works as a baker at Walmart, and Brad was retired but in failing health. He had diabetes, heart disease, he had just been diagnosed with a stage 1 cancer, and he said he was just trying to survive long enough so that Janet could make it to 65 when she would collect his pension that he got from a company that he worked with. When they're telling me their story, now there's something really fascinating about it. Again, going back to what Stanley was saying and also Michael Moore. Brad's father got a job in Flint, Michigan. You know, everyone knows about Flint now. In 1954, his brother had called him up. They were sharecroppers, and the family was sharecroppers in Arkansas. His brother called him up and said, you know, there's jobs up here. I can get you a job at the Ford plant in Flint. And so he took a bus. He got a job there, and he worked there as a single man, and it took him a few years for him to send for his family. His dad worked there for 25 years. He retired in 1979. He lived until 2006. He had a full pension and health care benefits. So he spent 27 years in retirement, longer than he worked in the auto industry, and was completely taken care of. And when by the time he died, he had been able to take his savings, go back and buy the land that they had sharecropped in Arkansas. And that's what was left to Brad and his 3 siblings, all of whom were struggling. They were able to split a $500,000 estate from an auto worker. And it basically got them all out of debt. It was like it wiped the slate clean for all of us. It gave us a second lease on life. But Brad and Janet were still struggling. Janet's working as a full-time in a Walmart bakery. She's been there a long time, so she makes a little over $10 an hour. But when I talked to her, she had been working with an injured knee for close to 3 months. She was afraid to even take off to go to a doctor. Every time she tried to schedule an appointment, it interfered with the work schedule, and she had to cancel. So she had been working injured for months, and she didn't want to take off because she got the job because the last worker, she had been hospitalized for 3 days when she was only given permission for 2, so Walmart fired her. She worked there full time. She was making about $2,000 a month, but half her income went to health insurance, disability insurance, all sorts of different types of insurance that they were just hedging in case something went wrong. So most of their income was going to insurance. They were telling me that they couldn't afford meat anymore. They couldn't even afford to shop at Walmart. She was just like, we can't even afford raw ground beef. Our idea of meat is bacon and hot dogs and canned meat. And they said we had a little garden out back. Now you wouldn't normally think of them as poor. They don't qualify as poor. But this is the reality I found across the country, that there's a tremendous amount of poverty. There's a tremendous amount of wealth in this country, right? And globally, you know, and the way to understand this, like Oxfam, the British aid agency, they've released a number of reports in recent years. There are 85 billionaires who have more wealth than 3 billion people combined. 85 billionaires, okay? And since 2009, according to Oxfam, the number of billionaires in the world has doubled. Okay, so that should give you an understanding. Poverty is intimately related to wealth. To have mass wealth at one pole, you need mass poverty at the other. That is just a simple law of capitalism, right? During the 50s and 60s, certainly there were all sorts of social groups that were left out: African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, women who weren't in a traditional household. But nonetheless, we did have much more income equality during what Paul Krugman likes to call the golden age of capitalism than we've seen in U.S. history. And we have to view this, especially in hindsight, as an aberration, not as the norm. So in the U.S., the Waltons are worth $145 billion now. I did a long project on the Walmart working class. I don't know if they were able to get the book. It's an anthology that was published earlier this year, the Socialist Register. And the thing that's interesting about the Walmart and the Walton family, Walmart was founded on wage theft. That's the foundation of Walmart, that they would incorporate they would create these shells to avoid federal minimum wage laws. It was founded on exploiting women's work within the stores. And Walmart was a pioneer in terms of union busting, right? This is what their wealth is based on. It's essentially based on theft. At one point in the last decade, Walmart had 70 different class action suits alleging wage theft that they ended up settling for $500 million. That's just the cost of doing business to them. Of course you're going to steal people's wages because the fines that you end up paying are far less. So we have to understand that what we see again and again is a system built on wage theft. And we may all love our smartphones, or at least probably your kids and grandkids do. But as we've learned, Apple, of course, is also built on wage theft. It's built on wage theft in China, and as folks may know, there's also been a series of exposés about how it was essentially strong-arming the rest of the tech industry not to poach engineers so it could force down wages. So even though those are some of the best-paying jobs left in Silicon Valley, Apple was basically threatening to wage total war against Google, against Adobe, against all these other big Silicon Valley companies if they tried to poach their engineers. And of course, what that meant was no competition, and if there's no competition, you can push down wages. And the allegations are it's $10 billion in wage theft just from Silicon Valley engineers. So we have to understand that what we're talking about is an organized system of theft. Now, the way this relates to what's going on in the U.S., I'm sure no one is particularly happy about the midterm elections. But one of the things I'm always curious about is we saw this disaster. We knew this disaster was coming 6 years ago, right? Everyone knew in 2008 when all these senators came in on Obama's coattails that if something wasn't done, that serious to build a new coalition, that there was going to be this wipeout. And in 2010 and 2012, the Democrats in the Senate got a gift called the Tea Party, who ran these crazies who basically helped the Democrats keep the Senate when they shouldn't have had it. But nonetheless, they couldn't do anything to prevent this disaster. Meanwhile, if you look at the Republicans, they are organized crazy. They'll shut down the government. They'll impeach Clinton, for the most ridiculous crimes. I mean, I think there are plenty of other crimes Clinton should have been impeached for, like the welfare bill or NAFTA. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is they can get away with it and they don't pay any political price. Now, what I think we really need to think about is since 2008, there's been an 8% drop in household income in the United States. That is enormous, an 8% drop. Okay, if you look at historical charts of, say, the global GDP, you rarely see even a 1% drop. This is post-Great Depression. In the depths of the 1980s recession, one year you saw a 1% drop in the global GDP. So when you deal with an enormous aggregate, the line tends to be a lot smoother. Right, so that's why an 8% drop is absolutely enormous. Obama didn't cause it. This was obviously coming, this was rooted in the Bush years as well as the Clinton years, what he unleashed with all the deregulation of the financial industry. But all Obama has to defend himself is like, well, we didn't drive over a cliff. Instead, we drove into a ditch. He didn't address the housing crisis. In fact, he made it worse with his HAMP program that led to 2 to 3 million fraudulent foreclosures. There's still 19 million unemployed and underemployed. He hasn't addressed the student loan crisis or really just the absolutely criminal for-profit college industry. He didn't lift any water to pass the Employee Free Choice Act. Okay, you're not going to pass that just on wishes alone. He did not fight for it. That could have changed the terrain in terms of labor organizing. He didn't do anything in terms of immigration reform, and I don't want to get into the ACA. You know, I know there are a lot of people who think Obamacare is great, but you have to understand what it's really a victory for is the bean counters in the healthcare industry, and how many of them really vote. Okay, you know, how many votes are those? So all those things are things Obama could have done to address this drop in household income. That's why the Democrats got trounced in this midterm election. It's not for all these other numbers. It's not because they were swamped with money. You know, just at the northern end of the state, Chevron tried to buy the city government in Richmond, California. They spent $3 million, $72 per registered voter, and they lost to the Richmond Progressive Alliance because they had a vision that they were fighting, that they were willing to fight for, and that they were losing. So I'll wrap it up with that. There's a lot more I can say, but you know, it is really, I think, the role of progressives to, one, first of all, challenge free market orthodoxy, okay? We don't need two parties of the free market. And the way to do that is to just be clear, laissez-faire was planned. The state is central to the organization of capitalism. You don't have capitalism without regulation of land, labor, finance, and the environment. And that is things like this $8.7 billion tax break to Boeing in Washington State, where they then ship jobs out of state after they got the $8.7 billion tax break. Or throughout the South, we see auto companies that get $500 million or more tax breaks. Okay, this is corporate subsidy. Second, stop running away from what you believe in. Democrats have been playing by the rights rules for 30 years, and look how well that's worked out. Redistributive policies, but really the goal is to create the conditions for which these movements from below, and no one can say what shape or form they'll take, but create conditions that allow these movements from below to be able to challenge the system from the left. Thank you.